the welfare of the person doing the euthanasia. I think like in the recent years, compassion fatigue and like compassion dissonance, whichever term people prefer to use, has been a big topic in terms of lab animal medicine and lab animal science, right? Because euthanasia is still difficult on the person, even though we know the goal, what we're doing, we're giving the best care to our animals until that point. It was still something that meant quite a lot to us.
Hello and welcome to The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to advancing laboratory animal science. I'm Jennifer Smith, Chief Scientific Officer at AALAS, and also your host. Together, we'll discuss current research, emerging trends, and the innovative work that supports scientific progress with animal welfare. We are so glad you're here. Let's discover something new together. Welcome back. In this episode, I am joined by a colleague and new friend, Dr. Ning-Kit, or Kit, Tang. And Dr. Tang is a clinical veterinarian at University of California, San Francisco. She received her DVM from the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, where she also completed her lab animal residency. And I am thrilled to introduce that Dr. Tang is a new diplomat of AACLAM. So, Kit, thanks for being on the podcast today. We're going to talk about your paper recently published in JAALAS, Hypothermia as a Sole Euthanasia Method for Neonatal Mice. And welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So yes, I originally got boarded this year. I did vet school and residency at UC Davis. And a little bit before that, just to share my journey as a laboratory veterinarian, I actually worked at the mouse biology program when I was in undergrad. And that's where I got started. Worked a year at Genentech and then was able to get into vet school. And then that's kind of how I got here. So basically, I was from the beginning wanted to be a laboratory veterinarian. So very happy to be part of the community.
Oh, that is so wonderful. I think our listeners really like to hear how people come up in this industry and especially new people. And so I think that's really great. I think that you are not the first new person into our industry who has really known that they wanted to be a lab animal vet from the beginning. And so I think I'm hopeful that that means we're doing a better job at outreach and hooking you guys early on. Us old timers, a lot of us just kind of fell into it as a career. So it's so exciting to see you guys really focus, knowing that this is what you want to do. All right. Well, let's just jump right in. We would love to know kind of why you took on this topic, what made you interested. This is a wonderful paper. I know we're going to be excited to hear more, and we just love to hear kind of, again, why you took this on.
Thank you. Yes, very happy to be here. So in terms of my paper for hypothermia for neonatal mice, so really it all started because I needed a paper to sit for boards since I did not have a first author before doing residency. And that was actually one of my biggest fear while applying because I wasn't sure if I was competitive because I didn't have a paper. I wasn't board eligible in terms of that aspect. But Davis was really nice, my senior vet, which I'm going to throw his name out there a lot, but Dr. Jake Theo, he was very supportive and he's one of the senior vets who tends to they have a list of ideas for residents to do papers. So for us, like he was kind of like my mentor. Like he was the one, not that I don't love my other senior vets, which I will probably name drop them as well. But so he was the reason why we were chatting. Because my first year was also Davis's AALAC year, which brought up a lot of things to think about, right, when we were looking at our program description. And something that really came up for us was like euthanasia methods, since as we know, the 2020, it's been 5 years now, but it was still like a new, the new euthanasia guideline is out, like everybody needs to be updated, things like that. And so he kind of talked about, instead of doing like a PK study, which we tend to do with the residents, he wanted something different. And so he was like, do you want to do a euthanasia project on like neonatal mice? Because that's something, we have to train people on their like husbandry staff, lab staff, because neonatal mice are very different as we know it. And so we chatted about the few methods that the guideline talks about for neonatal mice. And this brought back a memory for me because when I was working in undergrad at mouse biology, someone had mentioned to me when she was training me how to, do decapitation for neonates, she mentioned that some people would just put the neonates in a freezer and call it good. And I thought that I was very shocked. It was like, I don't know, maybe like 8 years ago. I was like, you just leave it in there? How do you know it's deceased. And she's like, I mean, it worked. So that kind of like stuck to me for a really long time. And so when like this whole circle comes around and now I'm a resident and my senior vet brought up this topic and I was like, I kind of jumped on him. I was like, wait, I want to know, like, does it work? Have people been doing this correctly, humanely? Like all these questions came up. That kind of like a long story, but that's how we kind of settle on together to do this as my residency project, since it is kind of also pilot. So we like to call it like a low hanging fruit because it was my first time writing a paper. So we wanted to make sure that it was something that I feel comfortable doing and was interested. And this topic turns out to be a great idea for us. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, that is such a great answer. And I love it. And I love that your transparency, like we all needed a project. And so we've all been there. I just love that you embraced it. And then, you were able to really look back and think, wow, I've actually had some thoughts about this going along. And I think it's always interesting when you're preparing for your AALAS site visit and questions, bigger philosophical questions like this come up. So I think that's fantastic. And again, kudos to your team for having a nice long list of projects to pick from. So speaking of your team, if you could introduce us, we know it takes a team to put a paper like this together. So we'd love to know who did what and, anything about the team that you want to share.
Yes, so as you could see on the paper, it was me, Dr. Theo, and then Dr. Rhonda Oates. So she's currently the AV of UC Davis. Kudos to both of them. Kudos to her, especially for that. So really, how it started was we were sitting in the office conference room talking about the idea, right? Like how to make it happen, because just an idea, but you got to put it into action. And really, Dr. Ronda was mostly supportive in terms of like what was available to me as a resident, like what kind of funding did I have, what were my options, regulations that I should be aware of, things like that, since I was moving into my second year of residency when we were chatting about this. So I still had quite a bit to learn about in terms of like Davis's regulation, things like that. And then Dr. Theo and I talked a little bit about our statistics, because we talk about how with papers, we want to make sure that our evidence we can use statistics, we can analyze our data, right? Because we want to get a meaning out of what we were doing. So he was a lot of my statistic support. So if anyone have questions on that, I would definitely defer it to him, because even though he explained to me, it's still a bit confusing. So really, we sat there and we talked about, so my literature search, right? We need to figure out, like, does this work? Because why is no one doing it? Does it work? Does it not work? So basically, we sat and we talked about, like, the resources, the statistics, and how to go about it. So really, because it was a residency project, I did most of the work independently. I had a lot of help even from people not on the paper, which I briefly mentioned at my acknowledgments. So the other senior vets, my residents made, they kind of gave me ideas on, like, the steps, what do I need to run this project. If you read the paper, there's the part with the histopathology. So Davis had the comparative pathology lab there, and they're really friendly people. So I was chatting with them, like, would that what could I do in order to have like a stronger paper? And I also wanted to know if skin lesion could be an issue, since there's hypothermia involved. And they were very supportive of me. They were saying, like, you should collect your sample this way, like you should take these notes. So really, it was like a team effort. I like to call them like my work family. It was really supportive. That's kind of how we decided on like projects. So really, it's my senior vet giving me advice, and then I was out there trying to figure it out on my own, like what to buy, what animals to order. It was a really good learning opportunity, to be honest, for other residents too, or other people working on their first paper, because it also helped me see what like a new grad student or like a new PI was going through. Because then like just my roommate, for example, when she was doing her project, she was like, I don't know where to buy mice. And I was like, I know how to do that. In addition to just working on paper, I learned quite a bit about what a researcher's side is like too.
That is such great information. I love that you shared that, Kit, because I think we were all once new. And I think it's so great. Like your question about, how do you buy mice? Somebody has to show you how to do that the first time. And I just love that you figure that out, and also that you're helping others with that. And I know this episode will be really helpful to anybody who's up and coming and is like, oh, I don't know how to do these things. So thank you for that and your enthusiasm of just like, hey, just jump in and do it. And it does sound like you have a wonderful team there, which is great. All right, well, let's jump into the paper because it's a good one, guys. So let's jump into the introduction. You did a really nice job of kind of concisely summarizing kind of what's the issue with neonates and euthanasia. And I would love for you just to kind of share some of that with our listeners, please.
Yes, so about the paper, as I like how my topic, it wasn't very punny, but it kind of tells you exactly what we did for this study. So really, the main question that we had was euthanasia, right, for neonatal mice. And one thought we had was for non-neonatal is that like other species, that overdose of anesthetic can be a method of euthanasia. And then in terms of our neonatal mice, for people who do work with them, you know that hypothermia is a method that's commonly used to do anesthesia work with them since they're able to recover unlike adult animals. And so we were thinking, what if we overdose on hypothermia? Because the guideline says it's acceptable with a condition to do nitrogen, like rapid freezing. But what if we just did prolonged hypothermia because technically we're just overdosing on anesthesia? And so that was kind of like where we began our question. But then based on my literature search and based on experience, right, I'm pretty sure most people in the audience that or anybody working on neonates know that euthanizing them can be quite difficult since they're very resistant, especially for people who wants to do like overdose of CO2 because it takes quite a long time. And hopefully no one saw that if it's not successful, then you see the animal revive. So most people I understand from at least where I worked, physical methods was how we were trained to do it. But that's why we wanted to try to find another method. What if we just do hypothermia? And so that's kind of how we began. But based on literature, it was showing that neonates could recover despite a long time in the cold. And, I'm probably skipping ahead in my paper, so I'll save it for the discussion part. We don't know how long it takes. And so that was kind of like the starting point for our study is to how do we go about this specialness, this uniqueness of neonatal mice? What other methods of euthanasia could we contribute? Like, could people use as an additional option to what we already know? We always want more method and new ideas, right? We can, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least we still tried it. Was kind of we wanted to do this project.
I think that's great. I love that summary. Thank you. So tell us what were, after doing your lit search and, you did a lot of prep work up front, which is fantastic. What was the hypothesis of your study?
So for our hypothesis, really, we wanted to see can hypothermia be a sole euthanasia method, which is our title. Sorry for the boring title. In addition to that, because based on the anesthetic guidelines saying when you do hypothermia, you need indirect contact because to protect the skin of the neonate from the cold. But I personally could not find anything where anyone actually looked to see if there were skin lesions based on like the cold, like is it actually working with the indirect contact? Because perhaps there's something microscopically that we didn't see grossly when recovering animals. And so the pathologists at Davis were really excited. They were like, sure, I want to see what the skin looks like after hypothermia. And so that's how we decided for my pilot study, which I didn't really touch on, but we did do a pilot study to make sure we could to minimize our numbers for our main project, because if it wasn't going to work in the pilot, we were not going to use additional animals. And so for the pilot, I had my neonates, and I had an agreement with the pathologist that I would collect the animals at the time of anesthesia, so like not responsive to stimuli, and then they were going to evaluate like skin for me to see if indirect contact could protect these animals. So really to see, does this hypothermia work? Are we truly protecting these animals with the indirect contact? So those are the two main things that I wanted to look at for this paper.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's time for a quick break to hear about the AALAS Learning Library. Hey, are you ready to elevate your team's knowledge and skills in laboratory animal science? Well, the AALAS Learning Library is your one-stop solution for comprehensive training. With courses designed for everyone, you can train your entire team in one place, earn valuable AALAS CEUs and RACE CE credits, and take advantage of group discounts to maximize that investment. Getting started is easy too. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly to explore a vast library of resources. Empower your team, stay ahead of the field, and grow with the AALAS Learning Library, your trusted resource for laboratory animal science professionals. I really appreciate that you have such a great team there and that you're able to kind of use those other resources, and especially the pathology, which is always just such a great validation for some of that. So this is exciting. All right, so let's jump into the kind of the methods, study design. I know you just briefly mentioned the pilot study. Maybe you could kind of expand on sort of what did the study look like?
So for our study, we thought about, first of all, how are we inducing the hypothermia, because we weren't doing rapid freezing, and we are really, the main goal that my senior vet had was like probably the freezer would be the only thing cold enough to perform successful hypothermia euthanasia, which in the back of my mind probably is, but because it is a study, we wanted to evaluate this other method works too. And so we had an ice water bath because this was to simulate how some people would do hypothermia anesthesia, where like they put animals either in cold ice water or like they put them on like crushed ice. So there's different ways of doing it, but we simulated by using ice water, which was like 4 to 5 degrees Celsius in similarity to actual anesthesia. And then we had the fridge as another component because the temperature is comparable to the ice water. And then we had the freezer, which we kept all of them at the standard setting. I actually Googled what is the standard temperature in like a regular fridge freezer. So that's how we came up with our temperature. And I do explain a little bit more in detail how we monitored the temperature of a thermometer, but I explained a little bit more about how fluctuation was discussed and like recorded for the data purposes. So that was how we did our pilot. I need to go back a little bit. So I had 2 animals per each of these advised to just account for potential variation, because one animal, like it could be, there could be variations, but we didn't want to use too many animals. So we decided that 2 per group just for our pilot to see if it actually works. We had 2 age groups, day 0 to 2 and day 8 to 10, because based on the AVMA guideline, hypothermia is not acceptable beyond 10 days. So that's how we chose these 2 age groups. We just picked the 2 extremes because we're like, if we can see what the extremes look like, we can kind of stipulate what the middle area looks like, was kind of our thought process. And so that's what we did for our pilot. I had these 2 age groups and these 3 devices. So we found that only the freezer was able to euthanize our day 0 to 2 pups. They were very resilient in the ice water and the fridge, because based on literature, I found that pups that were in the cold, like similar temperature, were able to revive after 2 hours. And my pilot proved that it was true. And I do not think 2 hours is an acceptable time to euthanize anything. And so we only stuck with the freezer for the younger pups. And in terms of the older pups, the ice water and the freezer did work, which already kind of gave us a sense that perhaps there was some major changes that already occurred during these few days of development in this animal's life, which to them is a long time, but to us is like a weekish. And so we were able to use the older animals for all the devices for the main study. So that was how we kind of did our pilot. And we used the pilot also to determine our time points. So based on anesthesia, textbooks guidelines, it takes about like 5 to 8 minutes for the cold to anesthetize the neonates. So since we were using a commercial fridge and freezer, we couldn't view the animals consistently. We did think about some other ways of monitoring the animals, which are discussed in limitations, so I'll touch on that later. But so we gauge at 5 to 8 minutes. So we'll check the animals every 5 minutes to see if they're responsive. So I probed them with a probe, like mechanical stimuli, to see if they're responsive. And if they didn't move, then I deemed that they were sufficiently anesthetized. And so that's how we kept checking for anesthesia. And then once I finished checking anesthesia, I also had set time points on when I removed the animals from the cold. And then I placed them on a heated pad, like a cage-free bedding on top of heated warmth, to see if they were resuscitated without any other stimuli. So only warmth was given back. Because based on my literature search, the idea that these neonates are so resistant is because if mom leaves the nest in the cold, she doesn't come back for a while, right? Because she might be finding food, doing some other thing, and then when she comes back, she will stimulate the mice, but she also have warmth, and that should be what's like bringing these animals back to awake, alert, that kind of thing. And so that was how we decided to evaluate for resuscitation and recovery for these animals. And so I would really just watch them. And we said that an hour time point was the limit. If an animal was not recovered after an hour, then it was truly euthanized, but I still performed the secondary method to follow the guidelines and to just ensure that the blood has coagulated and that the animal was truly deceased, and I was just watching it. So that was how the idea of the, like, that's kind of, I know I'm jumping place to place, so I apologize for that. So if anyone have questions, feel free to ask me. But that's kind of like the step. Really, I use 5 minutes increment to decide the anesthesia, and then we remove animals at decided time points to see how long it actually took for them to recover. If that makes sense, or if Dr. Smith, you have like, if there's some way I could clarify this better.
You did a great job, Kit. I love it. And I love your enthusiasm for this project. I think that's amazing. Especially, I think we really all appreciate just hearing more about your pilot study, because what a great way to kind of jump into this in, hey, let's just use a few animals. Let's see what works. And I really loved how you described that, because you saw some pretty extremes, right? And then you were able to shape the full study, the methodology, I should say, of the full study based on that pilot. And I love that. And I wish that was done more. So, okay, let's see. There's so much I want to unpack here. I loved also that your group really identified those two age groups as like, hey, let's just go to the two extremes. I think that helps so much fill in that knowledge gap for all of us of like a neonate is not a neonate is not a neonate. Like, as an age 1 day to 2 day neonate is not a day 8 day neonate. That makes sense. It sounds like they're
Yeah.
very different, right? Just so different physiologically, and so they need to be treated differently on a lot of levels, alive, but also in the humane euthanasia. And I think that that's what this paper for me really called out, is that they're not all this. A neonate is not all the same. All right. Well, now I want to know, what did you find? Tell us about your results. What was surprising? We'd love to know more.
I'm also looking at a table, so I have the numbers accurately. But so we found that the day 0 to 2 pups, like really the pinkies, they reach anesthesia really quickly. I checked the 5 minutes and they were unresponsive at the time. I mean, between 0 to 5 minutes, right? There is that 5 minutes of uncertainty of when truly they become anesthetized. But I can comfortably say that by 5 minutes they were. And then the part that was not surprising, but also surprising, was that for one single pup, it took about 26 minutes in the freezer's cold temperature for the animal to be euthanized. So this part, it's not exactly stated in the paper because it wasn't necessary, but basically any animal that was removed before 26 minutes of exposure time was able to auto-resuscitate while on the warm pad. So they would just spontaneously come back to life. So that was an interesting part of my study because, as mentioned, like they're in the freezer, so they were not under hypoxia. They were under hypothermia. So hypoxia, if for anyone who've ever put a neonate in CO2, right, you see that they slowly turn blue, purple because they're losing oxygen. But because in my study in hypothermia, they don't turn purple because they still had access to oxygen inside the freezer. And so they were pink when you took them out of the exposure. They looked like just a non-moving pup, like basically when you do anesthesia for neonates. And so really watching them for recovery was the most difficult part, because the moment if I see any movement, I was decapitating the animal.
So I want to jump in and stop right there, because that was so fascinating to me. The time that it took in the freezer, I knew it would be some time, but I had no idea it would be that long. And then I loved how you described the color change, because I think we're so used to seeing, ew, the pup is pink. They're fine versus blue. And so I really love that you called that out and were able to, put that in the paper and also tell us, because I think this is going to be kind of new for folks. And I think it's going to be really helpful. So keep going. We want to hear more.
Thank you. Yes, because that was something we discussed quite a bit earlier when I mentioned we were in like the room talking about it, because my AV was saying, how do you know it's euthanized? We were talking about, because if it's pink, just looking at it, as you mentioned, right? How do we know? And so that's how we came up with the 1 hour of watching the animal, because 1 hour of warm support, we were like, that should be euthanized. And then of course of the decapitation and checking for coagulation, because blood will coagulate after an hour of deceased. And so that's how we chose that, because really there was no other. It's difficult to tell if an animal has truly been euthanized, which is why we recommend secondary methods to people who are practicing euthanasia. So that's how we did it for the result we have for the one singular pup for the day 02. But for this project, right, as mentioned, we wanted to be realistic, and people are not going to euthanize one pup at a time. So we used the number 10 to assume like that's an average size litter, give or take, right? Less than 10 would be appropriate. More than 10, please split up the animals, was kind of like our thought process. And so we found that even for the groups of 10 for the day 0 to 2 pups, it took about 30 minutes for them to be euthanized. So this is like, we assume it would take longer, right? Because there's more animals and they can share body heat. But because of them being neonates, where they're poorly developed, they're basically ectotherms, right? So it still didn't take that much longer for them to become euthanized.
I think that part is also interesting because, logically you think there might be a compounding factor in time, but it turns out maybe not. So I think that was really interesting. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, no, that definitely was interesting. I was like hoping it was okay. Please do not be that big of a not much of a difference. I think goodness it was not. So that was interesting. And then in terms of the older group of animals, so it did make sense that it took longer for them to reach anesthesia, and it makes sense, right? Because they were more developed, they're more homeothermic than their younger parts. So that was something we were considering, because if it takes too long to become anesthetized, then like, is this truly humane for the animal? And so that was something we looked at, and for sure we saw that the ice and refrigerator, by 8 to 10 days, it was taking quite too long. And so earlier I mentioned like the 8 to 10 was because the AVMA guideline mentioned 10 days, but in practice most people do not do hypothermia for animals beyond 7 days of age. So there is that discrepancy. So if people are like looking at literature or looking at guideline, you might see these two numbers flowing around. So I just want to clarify that here, because some people did ask me this question. So for us, we follow the guideline, but anesthesia wise, in terms of practice, probably 7 days is usually where people kind of stop, because as I shown in my data, it takes quite a bit longer to anesthetize an older pup.
It's another really important point from this paper that I'm really glad that you called that out. Thanks.
Yes, so I can't say for sure after under 8 days of age, but for sure, like after day 8, please use some other methods of anesthesia. So, but for us, we did see that for the inside the freezer, so the coldest exposure for one animal in the freezer, it took about 10 minutes for each anesthesia. I know that in my table, the group of 6 also was about the same time, but it's possible maybe those pups just weren't touching each other as well, because I didn't purposely manipulate anything once the animal were in the chamber, right? To simulate that's how someone would do it. Like, they're not going to keep touching the animals. So we were like, well, 10 minutes, perhaps the animal was anesthetized between 5 and 10 minutes, because I can't prove anything within that time since I wasn't directly checking them due to the limitations I had. But then we saw that the singular pup, it took 15 minutes to be euthanized, which made sense compared to like the longer time for the younger pups, right? Because the relationship, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the results. But then for the group of pup, because they were still able to maintain warmth, it still took about 35 minutes, and we didn't think that was okay. That was appropriate. So that's why we decided, like, overall in our conclusion, that the younger pinkies, yes, because they reach anesthesia really quickly. And then in terms of the older pup, if this is your method, then one pup at a time, which is not, in terms of efficiency, might not be the best idea. But technically, if you are limited options, you could do this method.
Oh, I love that. Yes. And thanks for that teaser into kind of your discussion there. And again, for covering those results so clearly. Okay, so let's talk about the discussion. We talked a little bit about the results, what you found, what was surprising. A few things were surprising, at least to me. And then we always love to know kind of what limitations you might have had in the study. We'd love to hear more about that too.
So in terms of result-wise, like mentioned, so as we expected, the younger pups were anesthetized faster, but it took longer to reach euthanasia, because they were better able to like compensate for the hypothermia, which was what we expected, really, and it showed in the data, which I'm glad, because that made logical sense in my head. And in terms of the histopathologies, I'll just touch on briefly. I had sampled some control, the refrigerator, ice water, and the freezer. And the pathologist was saying there really was no, like, there's no significant changes, but they thought it was cool because you could see developmental changes between the day 0 to 2 and the 8 to 10 pups. Even though I'm not a trained pathologist, I can definitely see the differences in development. So that was interesting. But the good part was no lesions. So the way that we did the indirect contact with just like the paper towel with the animals, it was able to protect them from any really freezer burn or cold burns or anything like that before they reach anesthetic death. So that was good to know as well. And then we also use, I briefly mentioned this, but we use infrared to measure their temperature to really, because since we're doing the study, we wanted to get as much data as possible. So we use this method to see how much the temperature would change for these animals. And as based on our statistics, we found that, as expected, the colder the animal reached, the less likely they were going to recover. And it took a colder temperature to euthanize, like a colder body temperature to euthanize the younger pups versus the older pups. So those all made sense logically. So that was good too for us. That means our literature makes sense. So that was our result section. In addition to really the pathology, one other thing that we talked about and emphasized was the welfare of the person doing the euthanasia. I think like in the recent years, compassion fatigue and like compassion dissonance, whichever term people prefer to use, has been a big topic in terms of lab animal medicine and lab animal science, right? Because euthanasia is still difficult on the person, even though we know the goal, what we're doing, we're giving the best care to our animals until that point. It was still something that meant quite a lot to us at Davis, at San Francisco, everywhere I've been, really. So one thing for us to investigate was, could this help the person doing the euthanasia? Because as I mentioned, I've been with lab animals since I was an undergrad, and I was trained to do decapitation pretty early on in my career. And for anyone who's done it, it's pretty uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable, especially if you're at a place where you don't, anesthetize them, the neonate first. Like you just do physical method and, well, you're done. So that was something we discussed during our little prep meeting for this project. So, and I found the papers that talk about physical methods of euthanasia is quite hard on the operator. It can lead to higher compassion fatigue. And there are papers that, but depending on your experience, right? So some people who are used to, cervical dislocation, not a necessary animal, they might think that's better because they're used to it and they think it's faster, versus someone who's more used to CO2 narcosis. They may think that one's better because that's what they're used to and they feel that it's less physical. So that's the method they recommend. So really overall, that was something we wanted to discuss. Could hypothermia make the operator, help with the operator's fatigue? And since I was the person doing it, I did put in a little note in my discussion that when I was placing the animals in the devices for hypothermia, it was slightly uncomfortable because I didn't know what was going to happen. This was a completely unknown project for me. And I was just like, this is something I've never done before in these 8 years. And so that was hard. But then when I took them out to do my data collection, the timing, all that kind of stuff that I mentioned earlier, when I decapitated them to do my secondary at the time, the blood was coagulated. So, and I was like, oh, the animal's dead. Like they're like, cause I was trained right without CO2. So it was a very different experience. So I just want to say that for some people, perhaps it is more comfortable if they're not as used to the decapitation method. So that was something we also touched on. So that was kind of somewhere in my discussion. And then back to my limitation wise. So honestly, because this was like a pilot study based on a pilot-ish study, there were quite a bit of limitations that definitely I feel like future could look into. So as mentioned, we wanted to be realistic. What do we have in a typical institution? We have a fridge and a freezer. We have containers to place the animals in, but we don't have anything like a glass refrigerator or freezer where we can see the animals directly, because that would be really great, right? If we could see when the animals stop movement, but we couldn't do that. So that was one limitation we had. We talked about using a camera to perhaps observe the animals while they're under the hypothermia exposure. But based on like institution regulations, we discussed in the end that perhaps that was not a good idea. So we did not proceed with that thought. And then something that did come up to, I thought about after doing this project was a colleague had actually asked me, is like, did you do any like chemistry? Did you look at, stress hormone or like anything like that? And I thought that that was a really good idea, that perhaps in future, if anyone wants to do a similar study, at the time of anesthesia to collect blood to run these tests. I actually looked up how to collect blood from neonates, and some people do mention just because of the volume difficulty, decapitation really would be the method to get a good sample size. Because there, at the time of me writing this paper, there were two papers that I was aware of that looked at hypothermia in neonates. I think one was on rats, and to see like was it stressful compared to other methods of anesthesia, and then they showed that yes, it was stressful. However, the question here for me was the stress the recovery from the anesthesia of hypothermia, or was it during the hypothermia? Because in my study I didn't recover my animals, so it's difficult to compare this aspect. So if somebody wants to do that, they could definitely investigate and find out for the community if the recovery versus the induction is the stressful part for these neonates. So that was something I definitely really wanted to follow up on in terms of limitations. And then for my study, I used CD1s, which is a stock. So there are papers that looked at euthanasia versus of different strains versus stocks, and there was definitely difference. And even working in the laboratory, we know different strains just react differently to different things. So that is something to keep in mind if anybody wants to try this method, because I use CD1s. Might not be applicable to other strains, but a reference is there. We had the two age groups, right? I don't know anything between the middle. I can approximate that perhaps it would be the numbers would be in the middle between my two ends, but I can't guarantee that because I don't have the physical data. And then in terms of our device, we use a clean, completely new freezer. However, if someone uses a freezer that has carcasses in already, perhaps the airflow could be different, how temperature is maintained could be different. So really, there are a lot of factors that could be investigated for this method.
Oh, I so appreciate such a comprehensive, kind of your list of limitations. I think that's the hardest part, right? To kind of come out and say, yeah, we did this great paper, but there's some limitations. But we really appreciate that because we know that there's always going to be variables. I really applaud your group for putting such a good list together. I did also want to call out in your discussion just and kind of what you articulated so well with the compassion fatigue or dissonance. I think that's so important. Your experience of doing decapitation, for some of us, starting out, that could be, kind of a first job duty. And so I really appreciate just that this study was able to kind of take that into account as well. And I do think it could potentially improve that. So I appreciate you sharing that and your experiences as well. Oh, I feel like we could talk about this for a long time because there's just a lot to unravel here. But unfortunately, our time is up. So anyone listening to our podcast know that we ask one final question. It's always kind of the same, so sorry, not so exciting. But for you today, we would love to know what advice you would give anyone who's working in a program that really is wanting to update their anesthesia protocols for neonates. They're not neonatal mice, I should say. They're not quite sure where to start. And what advice would you give after going through this really extensive project?
Honestly, I think based on how we talk about the compassion fatigue, is that having options. So there was one paper that really dived into compassion fatigue, which I rightly recommend reading. Having options, the right to choose, the freedom to choose something was actually the most helpful in terms of compassion fatigue for a lot of people, because if you only told you this is the one thing you can do and there are no other options, it makes people feel perhaps they're in a very cage, very having the right to choose which works for you and they're all acceptable. I think that's how it is. Like in even working with animals, right? Like that's what we call as practicing medicine. There's no one way to do something. And so I think to update your euthanasia protocol is that investigate, like go into the literature, see, because there were many people, which I read many wonderful papers, people are investigating different ways of doing humane and appropriate euthanasia. And it's good to look at these papers, follow, obviously the guideline is out there, but like to see what these options are and train people to do all these options. Let them know that these are your choices, and whichever someone's most comfortable and most efficient at, perhaps that would be the method that they want to practice. It's what I believe, because if you say this is the only way you can euthanize a mouse, and someone may have experience elsewhere and they're more efficient in another method, could find that, oh, but like I like this method, like no one's listening to me. So I think that is one big part of our project as well, and for my advice for people for their institution. I kind of went.
We love that. You are very wise. I really appreciate that wise answer, and that ability to give people the choice of which humane option to use that works for them. I think is such a fresh way to look at a really hard task, which is euthanasia humanely. And I really appreciate that. So thank you. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our interview, but I have so enjoyed this. And I also so enjoy the fact that we are welcoming you into the AALAS community. Congratulations again on passing your exam. We are so thrilled to have you. And I look forward to hearing a lot more from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to advancing laboratory animal science. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. To find out more about this guest or the conversation, download our show notes wherever you access this podcast. And please join us for our next episode. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.